All right, well, we'll go ahead, I think, and get started. So good morning. My name is Kathleen Vogel. I'm professor and deputy director here at the School for the Future of Innovation Society, and I'm also chair of this job search with one of the talks that we'll be hearing today, and I'm so delighted to welcome here. Today's the continuation of a set of talks that we're having connected to a senior faculty job search in SFIS in the area of science, technology, innovation, and racial justice. And we're so pleased to have this morning Dr. Patty Romero Lankao. Dr. Romero Lankao is from the National Renewable Energy Lab, otherwise known as NREL, their Center for Integrated Mobility Sciences. And she joined that center in 2018 as a senior research scientist. She also has a joint appointment with the University of Chicago's Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, where she's a research fellow. Her work examines the interactions among peoples and cities with a particular emphasis on the sustainability of energy systems, mobility, and the built environment, as well as their resilience to disruptive events. Throughout her career, Dr. Romero Lankao has developed a considerable body of highly regarded interdisciplinary research, and she has extensive experience working at the Science Policy Interface in the United States, in Mexico, and in many other urban locations internationally. Notably, she was also co-leading author to Working Group 2 of the Nobel Prize-winning IPCC Fourth Assessment Report. So we're so very excited to have her visit today. Her talk is entitled Enhancing Potential for the Realization of Justice in Urban Sustainable Transitions. So welcome, Patty, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me share my presentation. And first of all, I really want to thank you for trusting me and for allowing me to share with you some highlights of my experience, my own journey, engaging with many disciplines, many experts, many scholars of all sorts of in many countries to really address the key challenges we are faced with and the ways to enhance our capacities to address those. And I really want to start by saying that it's something that I know many of you know, but it's still important saying that the current transition to new decarbonized energy systems, to new communities, is now, and different societies, is now as constrained by social injustice and inequality as it is by technological, climatic, and environmental limits. I'm glad that many now agree on something many of us were saying for the last 10 years, namely that cities, given the fact that they are sources of innovation, of energy use, and of many of the sustainability challenges we face, they can play a crucial role in this transition. But they can only play that role if we realize that solutions, innovations, interventions that are available only to the wealthy, to the few, that nurture resentment and resistance within by some communities, or that breed and aggravate inequality, are unlikely to be sustainable by any social, economic, cultural, or environmental metric. With this in mind, I want to start by telling you, briefly referring to the main areas of research I have focused on during my career. For once, I have engaged with issues of urban energy transitions, and I have emphasized the need not only to understand what climate modelers or what engineers can bring to the conversation, but also the importance of actors, their dreams, their fears, and their power to imagine inclusive cities. In this effort, for instance, we just finished with Clark Miller, an amazing book that really allow us to bring different ways of knowing and understanding to bear on thinking those futures. I also have worked on issues of science, technology, and policy, trying to always make sure that my amazing engineers and that data scientists understand that these are not only issues of optimization or of what technology to develop, but they are equally social, cultural, and political issues. And if we don't understand this, we won't get our hands around this challenge, let alone the solutions. I also have worked on what I would call urban climate change issues, trying to understand and to develop tools and metrics to understand how urbanization as a process of population and economic and cultural change relates, comes together with climate change to create and to be constrained by inequalities and to create differences in risks. Most recently, I have worked on issues of food, energy, and water systems, and I have also applied my tools to address this. I don't know why this is, oh, okay, there you go. So there are two cross-cutting themes that I have used to address these three main topics. One is the issue of capacity. I always have said, if we don't have capacities, how we can create capacities to use innovations, to manage risks, and to do this in ways that really allow us all to pursue our lives, our goals with dignity. I'm aware that governance and policy are, and therefore I have studied them, are not only the sources of solutions, as many of us would like to believe, but sometimes they are the key drivers of emissions, of vulnerability, of inequality. And why? Because these are key elements of determining how infrastructures are laid out, where they are laid out, who benefits, who bears the costs of these interventions and decisions. So I would like to have a couple of days to share with you all my work, but I really would like to mostly focus on two sets of highlights of my prior work, which I think can give you a sense of why is it that I'm really fit for this position, and how is it that I can contribute and learn by engaging not only with this school, but also with the other two schools we are to collaborate with. Let me start with highlights of my work on science, technology, and policy. But before doing so, let me insist on something everyone here for sure knows, namely that as it happens with sustainability, resilience, justice, equity have been defined in so many ways that I could take 2 days, to just talk about those. And I just really wanted to point to a very nice framework by Hebron and Macaulay, a framework that it is currently used by key players who moved to the Department of Energy and who are really trying to shake the space by making sure that many technologies address what they call the 3 phases of decision making when addressing justices in energy transitions. I don't want to dwell on this. I just want to say that I have mostly in my prior career dealt with distributional, procedural, and recognition justice, meaning with who wins, who bears the risks and impacts, and how we can recognize past inequalities in our efforts to address the future of cities and of communities. But now what I think is our next challenge is to immerse this in what now is being called cosmopolitan justice across it is called the energy life cycle. So that's for me the future of my work, and how I can use it to engage with different communities, to bring different ways of knowing to bear on how we can engage in restorative justice when engaging in our current energy transition, which, as you all know, is getting a lot of traction within the Biden administration. So there will be a lot of work to do, but we need to do it wisely. And that's why we need to really be careful in how we engage with this. So, okay, let me start with issues of science, technology, and policy. And I will share with you 3 highlights of my work seeking to create coalitions within NRAL that allow us to broaden the field, to really engage in different ways of doing research and development, which is what NRAL is about. And this first example is something we did. We got some little pilot money to engage with the coordinators of the Clean Cities Coalition. We are talking about 70-something coordinators, and to start engaging with them by asking, for you, giving your work with communities on the ground, what are the equity needs and mobility options, because they work mainly on transportation, that we need to address if we want to really engage with issues of justice. So to our surprise, 85% of them said that engagement in equity efforts can serve to expand their influence and their efforts. Particularly, they are saying that this year, they couldn't say that last year for reasons you all know. So when we ask questions, okay, what are the kind of data info you think we need to engage with to really enhance equity in transportation? And they say we need data on transportation disadvantage factors. We also need data to understand how our interventions will affect what are the economic impacts of our interventions and what are the health impacts of our interventions. Those are the three main topics, but they mention many topics. That said, I mean, let me tell you that as happens with many city officials I have worked with in many areas of sustainability, once you start to ask, okay, this is great, but what are the barriers you are faced with when dealing with this? Many mentions, we don't have enough staff, time to address these issues. We have not been able to partner with key communities and leaders that can help us really engage with underrepresented groups, and we don't have funding. Okay, so we also asked, that's great, but can you tell me with what stakeholders, I mean, of the many stakeholders you work with, who you haven't collaborated with to address issues of equity? And not surprisingly, this has happened in other efforts to understand how city officials and officials deal with sustainability issues. They have not collaborated with organizations or cultural brokers that connect them with the underrepresented communities, which is the one we have here. And they have not worked or directly engaged with underrepresented communities. So they are aware of the fact. And let me tell you, one of the key resource impacts of this effort is that just now DOE is telling us, okay, guys, help us identify those organizations, those means to really connect with the needs of these communities. So we are in the process of going there. But I just want to show you how I have learned to really be agile and nimble and always try to see, okay, if there is an opportunity now open, how can we engage with key issues of equity to address it? Okay, this sounds beautiful, but let me tell you, a key challenge we face in my lab, and I face the same in the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where I learned to really do a lot of beautiful stuff on risk and vulnerability. A key challenge is that for us to change the world, we need to change ourselves. We need to change the way we organize and lay out our centers, our labs, which are a jewelry for the US. And here I got again some money to conduct, and we call it inventory because last year we couldn't call it survey. So it's okay, I have learned to navigate the world. You don't want me to name A, I will call it B. And our goal was to ask what social science capabilities we have to bear on exactly the issues I care about, which are the societal, political, cultural issues. So we asked, okay, and let me tell you, 7% of the employees responded, mostly those that are working in the, are more connected with issues of connecting with society and policy, which is okay. I mean, and we have a very good series of findings already. So when we ask them, what is your area of expertise? You can say, see here, 50% are engineers, technicians, etc., plus some computer science and data science people. And here you have the others. I mean, we don't have many of the other disciplines that we need to bear on this issue. But let me now also tell you, when we ask them, okay, have you collaborated with social scientists so far? 35% said no, and no, 65% say no, and 65, yes, and the rest say yes. And when we ask, okay, tell us about the background of the people of social scientists you have worked with, they told us, I mean, 45% told us, well, we mostly work with people dealing with techno-economic issues, issues of optimization, economics, marketing. And then you see we have urban studies planning, international development, policy and negotiation, and look at here other disciplines. So my point being, and that's the point we will make in the presentation of these results, the point is, yeah, it is fundamental to develop technologies. Yes, I agree, we need to optimize our investments, but guess what? If we don't include other disciplines to bear on the social, political, and cultural dimensions of transitions, if we don't include people that really can help us understand why technologies are accepted or not, and how we can engage in difficult conversations, we won't be able to round it. I call it to close the science technology loop. And this has a lot of significance on the ground because as I will show you in another project for which I got money, electric vehicles and many innovations are presented as the solution to climate change and mobility. And many of the engineers say, well, you just need the right technology. Well, what we are claiming in this effort is no, because the future is not only about the best technology. It's not only about electrifying or automizing transport. It is also, and most importantly, about mobility, in this case, opportunities, open, and how they play out across populations and locations. And let me quickly walk you through a key effort we engage with. This is an interdisciplinary effort. And what we did was to examine how socioeconomic and environmental factors relate with EV adoption and other mobility outcomes. Here I'm presenting to you the results from one of the two analyses focused on 30-something larger metropolitan areas, but we also have more than 100 smaller areas. And we use indicators at the highest level of resolution. Here is the data source. I don't want to dwell on this because I have a lot to say, but what we did was to use the quantitative methods that have allowed me to speak to these disciplines, right? We've combined scaling techniques with hierarchical clustering to create 5 clusters of populations based on the combination of key socioeconomic, demographic, and built environment factors. Here you see how the combination plays out. Let me just tell you, the very high income here, which we were forced to call Pisces, because last year we couldn't talk about this thing, is here. And it has very high levels of ability to afford housing and transportation, very high levels of education. It can live wherever they want. We have a lot of maps that show that. And we have on the other extreme, the very low income group, which tends to live in very densely areas and to have very low levels of affordability, home ownership, very low level. I mean, it's a very diverse group ethnically. And what was most important, and this is what we presented, and people say, yeah, we already know it. Yes, we already know it, but we are not doing a lot about this, is that when using key indicators of outcome, we found that the very low to middle income groups, which are areas in particular is the very low income, tend to be at higher risk from exposure to air pollutants. They tend also, as you can see here, to be the ones that use transit, which they continue to use even under COVID. And but when you ask, okay, who is adopting the electric vehicles, you see that the very rich tend to be the ones that possess the electric vehicles. Meaning, and this was our key message to VTO, which is the vehicle part branch of the DOE. We say, yes, we need technological innovations. We need solutions, but they need to be tailored in such a way that they provide mobility benefits to the largest numbers of people. And by so doing, and we show some numbers I cannot share just now with you, sustainably decrease emissions, reduce congestion, because if we continue with the car paradigm, no matter how electrified, we'll still be congested, and improve the health of people and ecosystems. So let me now, because I want to also show, I mean, this is mostly work on science, technology, and policy, mostly focused on emissions, on energy transitions. But I also have done a lot of work on vulnerability, risks, inequality, and adaptive systems. Here, I just will very quickly walk you through some examples of this work. And by so doing, let me tell you, I have done work comparing at the global level how indicators of urbanization and climate hazards climate hazard exposure relate with indicators of vulnerability and capacity. But I don't want to share that here with you. I really want to talk about the comparative work I have done with cities in Latin America, with cities in India. And I cannot talk about Boulder, but I also have done a lot of work here locally with city officials in Boulder County. Okay, the question that moved us to develop this proposal was whether spatially unbounded hazards such as air pollution create health risk across socioeconomic lines. This was an effort where we involved epidemiologists, atmospheric modelers, together with social scientists. And we did not only do quantitative, but also qualitative ethnographic work. So to present the results of this part, we engage with two interesting theories. One is the risk society theory, developed by Ulrich Beck, a German that I learned to read when I was a student in Germany, according to whom in the current era of modernization, the risks we are creating, such as those related to climate change and terrorism, are such that no one, even the rich, will escape. Meaning we are already experiencing a boomerang effect, whereby what goes around comes around to hit us back. Political ecology and environmental justice scholars claim, on the contrary, and they really have been criticizing this guy for years, that risks are unequally generated and experienced. What we found, and as I was telling you here, I'm really briefly describing the methods and data we use for this adaptive project that involve, as I told you, 4 cities: Mexico, not surprisingly, Mexico City, Santiago de Chile, Bogota, Colombia, and Buenos Aires, Argentina. Sorry for my Spanish. So quickly, what were some of our key findings? And here we only are sharing results for 3 cities, Mexico City, Bogota to the right, and Santiago to the left. And to the right, you see the social vulnerability indexes we built. In the middle, you see the respiratory mortality rates. And here you see to the left the cardiovascular mortality rates. What is what we found? We found that indeed vulnerability is unequally distributed. That's not a surprise for anyone. But what was surprising for us, and we ran and ran the numbers again because we knew we would receive a lot of fire, was that the distribution of mortality rates did not coincide with the distribution of vulnerability. A very amazing postdoc that is now a tenure track professor at in Ohio ran some statistics, specialist statistics. And yes, the average concentration of pollutants is not correlated in this study with vulnerability, meaning that communities with different vulnerability levels have similar risks of mortality from exposure. I want to emphasize from exposure, not from capacity to respond to these risks, you know? And this means that no matter the fact that some risks will have, some hazards will hit everyone, we will have always different capacities to recover. And that is something I have also found in Boulder, even though Boulder claims to be rich and amazing, there are already vulnerable groups here we have been working with. So that means that climate change and urbanization contribute to inequalities in risk and capacity, and that differences in these spring from social inequality and from historic injustices. And here I will link not only work we did in Latin America, but also work I did with an amazing group of 90 students in Mumbai. The deal I got with colleagues who were running atmospheric inventories was that if I trained the students, they would allow me to ask the students to conduct 1,300 surveys. This has been the best effort in my life because usually I don't get money to do so much. Okay, so our goal was to examine the relative importance of indicators of wealth, sensitivity, and capacity on households' vulnerability. And we claim something that for you is, voila, I know that's true. Under current conditions, poverty and capacity contribute largely to vulnerability. But for many more conventional scholars, this is not so clear, believe me. So that's why I did it. Okay, why India? As many of the cities I have worked with, it is faced with high levels of risk of impacts from, in this case, sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding, which result from the reclamation of large areas of land just above sea level, with many areas below the high tide level. The city is faced with some of the highest levels of inequality and informality I have come across in my field work. But it is also full of people with lots of source of agency and capacity. So what we did, inspired by work done by Hallie Iken, was to use a series of indicators of poverty and wealth that also define capacities to recover from hazards, indicators of exposure and sensitivity, and most importantly, indicators of social, institutional, cultural, and human capital that can only be captured through surveys and field work on the ground. We weighted those indicators with input, with the knowledge of our local partners, and we use this analytic hierarchy process that allows you to weigh the indicators by sharing your subjectivity and holding each other accountable. In terms of, okay, if we are to agree on the fact that for a city like Mumbai, having access to pipe water within the premises is more important than it is in Latin American cities, I mean, we need to define that by working with local people. So we use fuzzy logic to create and compromise programming to create 4 groups of households, which are fuzzy because when you see the very high vulnerability group next to the high vulnerability group, they share some characteristics. That's why fuzzy logic is such an important tool. So Not surprisingly, only 5% of the population is very resilient in Mumbai, and more than 55% are vulnerable. But also interestingly, only 12% are highly vulnerable. Not surprisingly, we found that the poorer the households, the higher their vulnerability and the lower their capacity to respond, to perceive, to recover. But something we found that is parallel to what we found with our global level studies is that, with the exception of the very highly vulnerable group, for the other groups, exposure, the other groups are more or less at risk from exposure to hazards. Again, it's the capacity to recover what so far matters. Another interesting finding is given by the fact that, of course, the very vulnerable groups do not have so much access to official sources of warning to respond to hazards. But what is very interesting is what we have here to the right, given by the fact that while very vulnerable groups rely on more immediate family, neighborhood levels of sources of support to perceive and respond to stresses, the opposite is the case with the other groups. They tend to rely on more formal, broader sources, more official sources of support. And this is what brings me back to Latin American cities, because also we found during our field work and our little surveys that were not as big as the ones in Mumbai, that awareness of public information systems is very low. And while when we ask the households who you rely on to respond to events, the low-income households say they relied on neighborhood means and personal knowledge. Middle-class income households were more dependent on individual access to official announcements. Let me, to close this, I think I'm okay with my time. Yes. So let me close with something that was really not expected by us. When we asked the households in Mumbai whether they had access to 24-hour electricity services, 80%, almost 81% say they do, which we didn't find in other Latin American cities. And the opposite happened with access to pipe water on premises. Only 69% of the households in Mumbai have access to pipe water. And let me tell you, another thing we found is that, particularly in Dhuravi, one of the largest informal settlements in Mumbai and in Asia, around 80 households share 3 public toilets, which is not something we find a lot in Latin America. But the question then becomes, The question then becomes, okay, why is this? And that's where you need to rely again on ethnographic work and on understanding of historic processes of creation of injustice and inequalities. Why? Because historically, and also you need to understand that infrastructure and decisions as to where invest on water services, who benefits from those and who bears the risks, are political decisions that create path dependencies that are as hard to change as the infrastructure layout itself. So in the case of Mumbai, historically, elites facilitated investments in electricity over water and sanitation. This means that once an electricity grid is constructed, the cost of individual connection is marginal. That's not the case with water and sanitation. The costs of extending connections to water and sanitation and transporting water are very high. Therefore, in Mumbai, water and sanitation networks spread along lines of formal development and legal housing, which most populations, as I showed you before, lack. And let me draw a parallel with Mexico City, because I wrote for my master's thesis a history of water management and use in Mexico City. And I found that in Mexico City, the elites at the dawn of the last century were more obsessed with water and sanitation, invested, really engaging huge investments to provide the city with water and sanitation. And that created a situation whereby the city, for many decades, till neoliberalism took hold in the city enjoyed some of the higher levels of access to water in the country. So again, if we want to address inequalities, we need to really take a look at history and pay attention to policy. So socio-institutional, technological, and environmental conditions shape inequality, not only in access to innovations, to technologies, to internet, but also in risk. And they do it in nuanced ways. And that's why we really need to engage with different disciplines and different communities to bear on these issues. And I want to insist on something that I know for you is well known, but not for everyone. Rather than just technical or scientific exercises, the efforts to understand and to respond to all these problems are socio-political as well as technical endeavors. So, as I told you, my first piece of highlights are, I think, really fit into what this SFIS is about. This kind of work really fits and really informs and can contribute to what the School of Sustainability and also the School of Adaptive Systems can do. Let me close, because I only have 5 minutes, with, okay, this is all beautiful, but how will we connect all the pieces together? How can we connect research with engagement, education, and training? And my intention is to not start from scratch, but to connect with existing projects, such as the project cities and other ASU initiatives. And to create, I was thinking of creating a lab. I will refer to this in the later slide. But to do this based on what I learned very young in my career in Mexico City. And I learned that from Paul Freire. I mean, you cannot engage in real transformation if you don't engage your students and your peers in efforts seeking to understand together with communities what the problems are, what their needs are, and what the solutions are. You cannot do it. I mean, there is no way around it. You might create the great models, but no one will pay attention to them. Because in the process of so doing, you are creating bonding, shared identity, trust, many elements that make efforts more successful, right? So it is very important, and believe me, I know it because I came from a very poor origin. It's very important to understand that persistent barriers exist, subtle biases exist that really make it harder for underrepresented groups to break through, no matter how well prepared they are. And so it is important to be constantly aware of those and to really work not only with improving our teaching style, our research style, being good citizens, but engaging with the structural factors that explain these differences and addressing them institutionally. Now, I need to be aware of the fact that now I'm an academic person. And as such, I have a positionality that I need to be aware of. Meaning, no matter how hard I try to listen to, engage in co-design projects, I have a power position that I need to be aware of, and I need to be aware of my limits to really embody the struggles, the fears, the dreams, the desires of other communities. And that's, I think that everyone says this is easy to address, but it is not. It is possible to address, yes, but it is hard to address. So I think that I will do that. And when moving to my last slide, which is, okay, so what would be the next steps? I was thinking of creating what I call the Just Lab, and not creating it from scratch, but connecting with existing initiatives and continue being inspired by new philosophies, but also by a very simple philosophy I learned from as a student, and which has guided me in my life. And this is by Paul Freire, who said many beautiful things. And I just want to share one. Education for him is the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their own world. And this is really a constant process of learning, whereby all the parties need to be humble about the fact that different ways of knowing are important to bear on the problem and the solution. So in this lab, students, colleagues, researchers, partners, but in this case, students, right, will engage in seminars from, they can be undergraduate seminars, but also advanced seminars that will allow them to discuss key literature and case studies, design and evaluate solutions for enhancing justice in a real world case of their choosing, included the cities I have been working with and I will always work with till I die. I will be standing and working till I die, right? As part of projects underway. So a key part of this needs to be, of this seminar and other seminars I am intending to put together, will be learning, practicing and applying tools like professionals do to evaluate action alternatives, meaning there will be a lot of effort put into working with real world situations, cases, and trying to develop together as part of the end product ways to understand them, to address them, to solve them. And working with key stakeholders, key communities needs and has been always part of what I do, and I will continue to do at ASU if you allow me. I want to, you just tell me and tomorrow I will do it. Okay, so I want to close with this because I was telling someone in the committee, I have been really creating coalitions within NRAL to bear on the fact that we cannot just continue maintaining the current paradigms when designing and deploying technologies. And in this case, the current paradigm is the car paradigm. And I am really concerned that if we continue to focus on individual cars, we won't make it. And we won't be able to address many equity issues. So that's why I'm closing with this one. So I think that's all. And I'm really looking forward to listening, to hearing, to getting your input and your feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Patty. Great talk. So I will be managing the Q&A now. If you can either physically raise your hand or use the little Zoom emoticon, or if you have a question you want to place in the chat, I'll be trying to monitor those and be ready to call on folks. So if anyone has a question to start us out with. Oh, I see. Alex has her hand up. So Alex, I will let you go first.
Oh, let me find my video so you can actually see me. Wrong screen. Here I am. Hi, Patty. Thank you so much for your talk. I always appreciate hearing more about the work when outside of just committee meetings with you. So what I'm interested in hearing about is, can you talk about aspects of your work that explicitly address race and racial dynamics? And in particular, what I'm interested in you talking about is any of your work that offers agency for people of color and gets away from tropes such as they're vulnerable, they're disadvantaged, they're poor, they're going to live in a bad neighborhood, all of these kinds of things. Thank you.
No, thank you. This is a great question, and I have worked on this on several fronts. And let me talk about the most challenging one. And let me give you an example of Bogota, Colombia, and of Santiago de Chile. What we did within Adapted was at first to hold meetings and conversations with underrepresented communities. In Latin America, we claim to not be racist, but we are really racist. Let me just tell you, because of all our colonial past. So in the case of Bogota, at first we held those meetings, we held meetings with city officials, and we tried to bring them together. And one of the leaders, a very young and very promising guy, told one of the officials, "You never come to our place." And the official answered, "We don't go there because you are criminals. I mean, I can be killed by you." And this guy said, "Patty, you have been with us. Did we kill you, rape you, or etc.?" I said, "No." And you know, I really engaged in a facilitation process, seeking to find ways to change that bias in the officials, and to show that these communities are more than criminals. They are really empowered to, I mean, they have means to understand what their problems are and their solutions are. So that's one example. I did something similar in Santiago. And but let me just come back to an example of Boulder. In Boulder in 2013, we were hit by one of the worst floods in the history of this city, with almost 10,000 houses destroyed, semi-destroyed, or damaged. I engaged in 2 years of just going to meetings, hearing, engaging with stakeholders. And I was able to, I told them, look, I can put my labor for free. I just want to be able to understand how we can take advantage of the history of Boulder as an entity that has dealt with issues of inclusion and address vulnerabilities of Latinos. And what we found was that although the city really tries hard to include Latinos, there are biases such as, first, the fact that they don't understand that many Latinos, even in Boulder, don't speak English. So what we did was to suggest to create warnings that are written in English and in Spanish. But most importantly, we suggested that it was important to rely on cultural brokers, local people that their communities trust and that we can connect with to really understand and bear on the needs of these people. Why cultural brokers, you would ask? Why not just go directly and try to talk to the communities? Because many Latinos are afraid to be brought back to Mexico, or to, you know, because they are illegal, etc. So this is one example of how you can address, by working with authorities, one of the vulnerabilities Latinos face, which is the fact that they can be sent back to their countries of origin because they are illegal. But there are things that you cannot address, and I really want to be honest about that. I learned by working in Boulder that even in Boulder, many Latino communities live in mobile houses that are faced with splintered tenure systems, whereby they own their house, but they don't own the land. So what we found when working with them was that no matter how hard we tried to help them, FEMA could not provide them with recovery money because they didn't own the land. So I'm telling you, there are things that I'm able to address by working with different actors, addressing the needs of, in this case, Latinos. And I hope you understand why I'm Latina, right? And I really care for my community. But there are things that are more structural and harder to overcome. So just now, the Boulder County is trying to, I mean, it's not that they can address the issue of splinter land tenure, but they are trying to create other options to create affordable housing with land tenure for these communities. So that's the kind of thing I try to do. besides working as a model, right, role model, I'm Latina, I always go to meetings, presentations where I speak to Latinos and try to empower them, but that's individual stuff. This is more about what I'm talking to you about is more structural stuff, more structural barriers that we need to address very creatively.
And so you were talking about Freire, and the way that Freire talks about empowering people to be actors in their own lives and not necessarily relying on others. So that would be the state, researchers, whoever. Is there anything that the work that you've done that eventually, in working in community, they no longer need the researchers, they no longer need the NGOs because they're doing it on their own, and they're self-reliant at a certain point? Do you have anything like that you can speak to?
Yes, I have one example. I have two. I can speak about two ways. For once, we work a lot on helping them position themselves, just facilitating the effort, position themselves and know what their capabilities, their agency is, and then move forward. Meaning there are some workshops we have organized just for them to know, okay, what means they have to be empowered and to continue without us pursuing their goals and addressing their needs. That's one option. But the other thing I have found a lot is that in some communities, you can rely on long-standing community groups that have done a lot of work before you arrive, and that you just can connect with because they have been able to develop the necessary agency to press authorities to work with different instances to get what they need. And one example of this is in Buenos Aires, in San Fernando, where we found that independently of whether they had the community and the NGO work with them, independently of whether they had an authority that was sympathetic to their effort, they had developed the skill set, the tools, and the agency to continue pressing and to continue holding others accountable and getting what they need. But some things, what I can tell you from my experience, there are some ways we can address structural factors and empower people, but there are others that they have developed themselves. So you need to be able also to rely on those. So those are my experiences with communities.
I'll let everyone else get to their questions. Thank you.
Now you're welcome.
Thanks so much. So next is Craig and then Kirk.
Okay. Thanks for permission, Kathleen, and thanks, Patty, if I may, for a terrific presentation, really a very good presentation. I want to follow up Alex's question in a sense and ask how you navigate the tension between policy making and policy advice and political economic transformation, which position a researcher like you differently and involve taking a perspective of the state, taking a perspective of a local community. So how do you navigate the difference between advising on how to help poor or marginalized communities and mobilizing those communities for a political economic transformation that might be at odds with the interests of the officials you are advising, particularly in terms of the difference between speaking about the vulnerable, if you will, and speaking in terms of race and racial justice?
Well, I want to use the notion of intersectionality because I tell you, I have played different roles and I have navigated this in different ways. And let me just start with the global. I have been engaged in the last three reports of the IPCC. And there, I was able to be in the negotiations and the discussions and the agreements on the final summaries for policymakers for the last two. And there's something I was trained for was exactly to be careful to not be seen, to be careful to deal with issues of credibility, legitimacy, and not to be seen as favoring one party against the other. And why? Because if you don't create that kind of wall that protects the two parties, you can, as a researcher, lose, and the effort can lose traction. So what we were trying to do was to always say, we are here to present the several options. These are the several sources of information, but we are not to make policy. And I know many people might tell me, but Patty, that's wrong. It's not wrong, because if the IPCC, the academic part, the scientific part of the IPCC starts, and it has been sometimes, to be seen as favoring one party, the ability to inform the construction of the reports gets lost. So it's a kind of communication coalition building effort. I could present on that. I even have a presentation on that. And you need to understand that many researchers come to these conversations with the dream that their knowledge is pure and no one can affect it. And decision makers come to the negotiations seeing the summary of our policymakers as a binding document. So that struggle is amazing. And I mean, I have learned to be careful to navigate that really, fine line that has allowed me to still be credible and for my work to be legitimate. But let me talk about a couple of examples. The first one I experienced as a student, a master's student, working with communities in Mexico City, communities who were threatened to lose their land to a very powerful project developed by the then President Salinas de Gortari. So we engaged with them. I remember because I was pregnant with my first girl. So we engaged with them. We co-produced, it's called now, but it was participatory work, co-produced their understanding of what the problem was and why they thought that they were as sustainable and even more than the projects that were promoted to take their lands away. So what I learned there is that I made a mistake by just engaging in the policy-making process without understanding that the government would be negotiating with one member of my group. We were called the ones providing technical assistance. And this person ended up signing the program and saying, yeah, we support it. And the community lost. So my lesson there is that there's a lot of limit to what we as scholars can do. We need to be humble about that and to understand that the policymaking process is very tricky, particularly when it is contested. So since then, I have learned to say, yeah, be there, be to empower, be supportive, but be careful, because your community, the group you are supporting, can lose in the process. So I could go to many other experiences, but I just wanted to share this with you because I always say, many people come and say, oh, I was successful at this and at this and at this. I just want to tell you, I have failed too, and I have learned from the experience. And that my first experience was really very, very teaching for me. But I have many other examples of how to navigate this science policy interface. And it's a very tricky endeavor. We should give training on that, just on that, how to do it well in ways that empower the communities you want to support and allow you to continue being seen as an entity that is there to support society as a whole. And that's a very contested issue. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. So Kirk, I see you're next.
Hi, thank you very much for this really encouraging and interesting presentation. My question for you, Patricia, is you just mentioned a moment ago just sort of what it is that scholars do. And you're obviously, I think, going to bring, if you were to come to ASU, a really unique background and set of skill sets to the school. However, I also recognize that you'll be making a really big transition from NREL and a policy-oriented domain into an academic position, right? And it was great to hear some of the plans that you laid out about the Justice Lab. However, can you tell me more about what that transition means for you in terms of wearing that professorial hat, advising PhD students, helping them to engage with academic theory that's pertinent to your work, and what that new position looks like for you?
Thank you for the comments to everyone, and also for the question. Well, in recent years, I have been thinking that I that increasingly my role is to empower the next generation of scholars, scientists, technicians, to bear on the challenge of engaging with different disciplines, given that the scientific work is very hierarchical, and engaging with different ways of knowing and engaging with decision making. So I already have started at NRAL to really focus a lot of my people, my young people. They are for me the key elements of why I'm going there. And I think that I can bring back to ASU a wealth of experience in how to, I know that some people won't believe it, how to build coalitions with different disciplines and with different stakeholders, etc., to bear on issues, how to bring different ways of learning, and how to start from a place of, oh my goodness, I don't know what this will be about. I will need to try and try again, to an end product that is fascinating because you were able to produce something everyone feels okay with, which is a key element of co-building things. So given that I started my career as an academic, I really miss the teaching part. I really miss the looking at the faces of my students, looking at their bright faces, their promising faces. And I really would like to go back and bring that to this wealth of experience to bear on these issues. And I tell you, and it's not that I want to make you feel good, but I think that the three schools are some of the best in the US at really developing tools, capabilities. I'm using capabilities because NRAL uses that word a lot, but methods, tools, ways of knowing, ways of connecting that really allow us to be part of the transformation we want to be in the world. So I would be honored to go back and not only bring my wealth of experience, but also learn from all the endeavors you are developing and see how we can build those coalitions, to transform the world as we see it. And most importantly, to transform ourselves in the process. So rather than, I see this as a good way, like what happens with Bach. I play the piano in my free time, and I love Bach. I started like Bach, right? Bach in his music is very circular, right? He starts with the Christmas oratorium, and then he has the Easter oratorium. I started teaching, and I would like to close my life cycle with teaching and being again an academic. So I really would love to be back there, and I'm certain, being that I'm an adaptive human being with the ability to survive the most difficult conditions, that being with you, and you are not difficult at all, will give me the ability to thrive together with you.
Thank you so much. So we do have time for questions. I have a question, but if someone also has another question they would like to raise, I'm happy to have folks jump in ahead of me. Okay, so I will jump in, Patty, with a question for you. Just given your amazing background, and I see Netra there too, so Netra, you're next. Your amazing background working in the national lab setting. I have also spent time at Sandia National Lab, so I'm always very interested in sort of expertise kind of in the labs. And I was just struck by you're commenting about the survey that you did with your colleagues, and just if there is social science expertise, it tends to focus on the economic side of things largely. And so I was just kind of curious, again, from your experience and background, how do we go about bringing more different kinds of social science expertise into the labs, like NREL or other labs? What opportunities can you imagine could there be, for example, for our students to try and bring some more of that social science knowledge into NREL? How could you see, for example, your position as an academic helping to bridge that sort of connection, let's say, between a place like ASU, NREL, or other labs? Curious if you comment, like, what is the hope for changing that great disparity in kinds of knowledge that are at the lab?
Let me tell you, I sense that in the next, we still have a couple of months more. during the next 2 months, we will be having still the opportunity to take advantage of a huge window that was opened by the fact that the Biden administration decided that any of the new projects, and just now we are talking about $2 trillion, right, dollars devoted to infrastructural projects, many of which touch on what NREL is about. Everyone in my group is excited about that. Biden said 40% of the projects need to benefit underrepresented groups. And everyone in my lab and in many labs is like, wow, we need to take advantage of this. What do we do? You know what I'm doing? I have been preparing for this. I don't know. At first, I did it underground because during the last administration, I could only work on climate change issues during my weekends. But what I did was to start to invite social scientists to come to give talks, to start to open spaces with people that are like champions, we call them. We are a couple of social scientists, right? With champions, I mean, to bring them, to create an external coalition of social scientists, people that go beyond technologies, and bring them back to, and my the lab, sub-lab director told me, Patty, you need to educate us. So that's what I'm doing. I'm creating a coalition of social scientists that as we speak are talking and will continue to be talking with them to reframe the issue. Because look, if we want to change the world, I have learned the hard way, we need to start by changing the way we look at the world, we approach it, we frame it. And I am convinced that's my mission, that NREL needs to do that. So am I telling you that everyone is happy with what I'm doing? No, they are not happy. They are even afraid, and I'm okay with that. You know, I'm navigating things, and I really think that when I leave, I will be able to keep that relationship with the champions and open spaces for us to bring those students, to put them in, because I know in which centers. I mean, not all the centers at NREL need to work with social scientists. You know, some people just need to develop the biotechnologies, the bio things. Others need to develop the solar panels, and that's okay. We need those technologies, and NREL is supposed to deal with those. The ones we need to work with are the ones in charge of deployment, of advising decision making. And not only in the US, we are working internationally. And I think that there, I will keep my connections and make sure that this lab, you know, is presented to them, that we go and present this to them and see how we can, as CEO Boulder is doing, create a center that has many of us working with them. The beauty of this is that we at ASU have all the disciplines, while Boulder is still thinking, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't be criticizing, but they're still thinking that the only thing we need is technology. Oh, no, this is not what we need. So I'm talking about coalition building processes, about working with champions, about, you know, knocking at doors, etc. Because, I mean, and that's what is beautiful about our work. If everything was about sitting down and running models and doing surveys, how boring. It's all about engaging, creating groups, working with people like you to open spaces. Because as we say in Mexico, if you don't speak, God won't listen, you know, and the gods there need to listen. And we need to speak loudly and very eloquently, very articulately if we want to be listened. So that's.
Thank you so much, Patty. Netra, I see your hand up.
Yes, yeah, my hand up. So thank you, Patty, for a wonderful talk, and then taking us to different part of the world, including Mumbai. You know, the discussion about poverty equals vulnerability, equals climate change impact, and so on, fascinates me. It has been fascinating me for some time, and I don't have the clue about it as well. But I also think that poverty is not about not having money. For me, it is about living a life that is not to its full potential. So that means for me, it has a number of different facets. One of that is about the lack of the ability to realize self as an individual. So given that, not knowing your research context in Mumbai, my question is, what does it mean to be at risk of remaining poor? And how much risk would be considered enough to know that someone is exposed to poverty and therefore vulnerable? There's a little bit of a different kind of a question around vulnerability, but I would like to hear your thoughts about. In a way, I'm also trying to stretch the meaning of poverty and vulnerability, which for me is not linear.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your questions. Look, I agree with you, and that has been always my thinking, that when dealing with issues of poverty or capacity, we need to rely more on approaches such as that developed by Amartya Sen or by the livelihoods scholars, whereby the issue is to understand how households who are agents draw on what assets to constantly pursue their lives and deal with stresses, hazards, and take advantage of opportunities. And many of the indicators I use, particularly when conducted surveys, try to capture that, try to capture not only whether people have access to infrastructures, but also how they continuously pursue their lives. That's why you saw, for me, and that's something Amartya Sen says, how can we pursue our lives with dignity? How can we envision a life that is full of opportunity, not only for us, but also for our children? And I think, and that's the approach I have used to try to capture how people, households I have worked with, communities I have worked with, go about their lives. And I always start with, okay, how do you go about your life? What are your threats? What are your opportunities? And we try to capture them, all the different assets, options, that they use or have at their hand. Your question is a question that many at NCAR ask me to address. Okay, at what level poverty is too much, risks are too high, etc. And I try to model that, etc. And I never publish the results because I think that it's more important that the main goal for me is rather to constantly understand what are the sources of capacity of agency people have? How can we take advantage of those? As I was showing you with the work on who people rely on to respond to threats and hazards, I was telling some rely on neighbors, etc. And I have found, for instance, in Buenos Aires, in San Fernando, one of the communities we work with is just so organized that although they don't have access to warning systems to respond to the sudestadas, which are the storm surges related to the changes in the Rio de la Plata and the winds, etc. I mean, although they don't have that support, they had devised a system whereby whenever someone learns that there will be a sudestada, he or she calls to another, who then calls to another. So they have a network, a source of social capital that for me equips them to deal with many of the challenges they face. But that source of capital is not enough. That's why in San Fernando in particular, we need to help them connect with the key players they need to express to get access to good quality water, good quality sanitation, good quality services. And you see, I try to capture what services people have, what assets they have. Do they have AC? Do they have electricity, etc.? And then what capitals, social, cultural, institutional, community sources of capacity they have. And this understanding of these sources is a dynamic process. I could tell you that if I go again to to Mumbai, I won't recognize the communities because the communities constantly change. Informal communities are constantly upgrading their houses, etc., and they are agents of their own change. What they need is to be acknowledged as such and seen not as they are by many authorities as source of the problem, but as key players in the finding of solutions. So that's why I just gave up on the idea of modeling all that. And I know I lost in the process because one of my advisors at NCAR was like, you need to publish that. I said, wow, come on. Yeah, I have that point, but as I presented, when I presented, the communities will be already changed. So, but yeah, I mean, but that's a personal thing. And I tell you, I decided to share some of these things because I know that some of you, like you, are working on climate change issues and adaptation issues. So I hope we can have a one-on-one conversation on this later on. But thank you for the question.
Right, thank you. So we do have time if someone has another question or two.
Kathleen, I'm sorry, I'm not able to put on my video.
Okay, no worries.
Video, but maybe I can. Computer issue. There we go. Thank you, Patty, for your wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I actually took a couple of screenshots, and because I wanted to reformulate. And so I had two questions that may overlap. One is this, the issue around cultural brokers that you've talked about, I think both in Boulder and in your previous, the surveys. And I want to know a little bit more about how the value you see, who are they, how are they engaged, and what has been the impact of the use of cultural brokers, as you have said, in the kind of complex issues and challenges that you face. And the second issue is around gender and mobility and transportation. We have, I think, 3 students right now, graduate students in SFIS, who's actually working on urban transportation and gender issues, especially on public transit and the safety, as well as the issues around class. So if you could talk to that second part. The second part is not as well formulated in my mind, but at least what has been your understanding around safety and women and gender and in public transportation and mobility opportunities moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start with the cultural brokers. Cultural brokers are for me a nuanced entity, or a very, very fuzzy entity, as are issues of social capital. Why? Because in my experience, some cultural brokers are themselves bearers of power and decision-making power that sometimes they don't use for the best of the communities they are to represent. Many other times they are. So I have a very, now when we are engaging with DOE on this, I will try to slowly say, hey guys, besides connecting with those cultural brokers, we need to understand what is their positionality in the community, how we can, whether we can really, what of their capacities we can use to empower communities, and for us to understand what the community's needs are in the area of mobility. And let me tell you, we have a lot of different needs here. We are talking about elderly who cannot drive, or people with pre-existing conditions who cannot drive, women, many of whom do not have the car when we are talking about poor communities, because there is only one car, and they are the ones that need to deal with the logistic of the households, which is I will touch on later on when I refer to women. We are talking about rural communities who have cars, but they have also problems with connecting with key services, etc. So in short, we are talking about many needs. So a key question we will be addressing is to really understand and unpack those cultural brokers. In the experience with Boulder, the cultural brokers we were able to connect with are people who have really developed, have a deep understanding, a deep connection with the needs of the Latinos we are working with. And we are working with them in areas of, not only in these issues of, oh, what are your vulnerabilities, but we really engage a lot in organizing parties, meeting, having dinners, discussing issues, talking about the youth, etc. Not everything is only about issues of vulnerability. But again, we need to be careful with the cultural brokers. They are nice entities, but we need to unpack them, because they have roles that are more nuanced than just the good guys that will tell us what the issue is. As for women, I have not, women and transport. We have captured some of the issues that women deal with in our work within my center, but I really need to be honest, I have not been able to design this kind of work I would like to do, which is to really understand that women, particularly when they have children, are driven by how to manage the logistics of the household, how to be available, to pick up kids, etc. And women, particularly in Latin America and particularly where I grew up, are really faced with a lot of issues of safety, meaning we can be harassed, we can be, there are many issues, and I have faced them in Mexico. So something I have been trying to bring up in my group is that we need to understand these issues of safety in women and the particular mobility needs and realities of women with means and with tools that my group has not developed, because they keep telling me the issue is an issue of optimization, meaning we need to provide them with cheap alternatives to move around. And believe me, if that was the issue, if that were the issue, we wouldn't be having this conversation here. I know for sure that there are a couple of very, very promising studies done in Latin America to capture all these things that you have referred to. And if you want, we can have a conversation and I can share those with you. But I have not been able to design a project to address this in the US. And I tell you, this is a huge issue in the US that needs attention.
Thank you.
Thanks. So just wanted to check if there is any last question that folks wanted to raise. I know we're getting close to the hour here.
This is he. I can fill in the last couple of minutes. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is teaching, Patty. And I was just reading through your packet of materials, and it seems that you've taught in a lot of different contexts. Can you expound beyond what you have in your materials to talk about the trainings that you've had, formal trainings around teaching, and particularly how those take on issues of racial justice and JEDI in the classroom, both explicitly as a content, but also recognizing that we are in an academic system that is unjust?
Thank you so much for this question. All the questions have been great. Look, when I was in Mexico, I was trained in the approach that my university developed to teaching, which was an approach that focused mostly on working with underrepresented communities around Xochimilco. This is an area that was historically affected by water issues derived from the decision to bring water from Xochimilco to Mexico City. So I'm trained I was trained there to how to deal with a very diverse group of students with very diverse needs. And let me tell you, I had some students that would tell me, Patty, I want you to understand, it takes me 2 hours to go from home to come here. And sometimes I cannot come. I even don't have money for breakfast, etc. So really, the students I work with really were faced with issues of exclusion that that are not comparable to what we see in the US. But I also want to be honest, when I moved to the US, I finally, after a couple of years, I finally realized that issues of race and identity loom large in this country. I have experienced them myself, because although I am mostly with very amazing scholars and colleagues that include me, I also have noticed some biases, right? Some like, no, come on, you are Latina, I don't think you can do this. But mostly I have not dealt with that. But the point I want to make to you is, I think that many of the barriers to inclusion of students, even in the US, go beyond just having a nice class and teaching your students and having a good curricula. They really involve engaging with key players in the organization to make sure that institutional barriers are addressed. And I don't know how ASU works. I just know how, for instance, a prior lab where I work works. And beyond the fact that they have a person in charge of diversity and inclusion, I really noticed that many labs, in particular that one, were dominated by white old people. And that really affected not only people of color or minority groups, that even affected young people that wanted to go up. So I really tried to target that, but I learned the hard way that I don't know how ASU is inside itself, right? I need to do some participatory work or some engagement in really understanding how things work in the ground. But I think that besides addressing these issues in the class, engaging with students, meeting them where they are, having extra class conversations to know who they are, what they dream about, what their fears are, what their challenges are. Besides that, which has been always my practice, I always will try to make sure that institutionally we address issues that can help really engage with JEDI, right, you call it, in ASU. So that's what I can tell you. And I know, and of course, I have engaged in some classes even some classes in the US. And more I have learned to deal with these challenges and make sure I become an agent of change, and I actively empower my students to pursue their dreams and address their fears and really get to achieve their goals. But that's the only thing I can tell you. And I'm really willing to tell more when we have our meeting on this. I think in one of the meetings that was planned for me. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you so much. Well, it looks like we're right a little bit at time here. So thank you so much, Patty. If we can just show our appreciation, I'll do a little Zoom emoticon for your presentation. Thank you so much. It's we've really valued hearing about your work and your thoughts. Yes, thanks again. Hope the rest of your meetings go well today, and we look forward to chatting with you more.
And thank you for your questions. Believe me, I will think of them and use them to work on my life and the next conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Patricia.